Hello, media theory people, and welcome to another short lecture. This week, or today, I guess, we're going to talk about Stuart Hall's Encoding, Decoding article. And this is, Hall's language can be difficult, but the good news is that I don't think that you'll find his overall theory too hard to understand. It's a relatively simple theory in some ways, but it's an interesting one. So let's dig in. So, the first thing that Hall does is he talks about the sort of the uh, state of the field, right, and a state of intellectual study, and he says, listen, the way that we used to think about communication was too simple. Indeed, we looked at it in what's called a linear fashion, or the linear model of communication. And it works something like this. The idea is there's a sender, someone, let's say like me, who sends a message by speaking, let's say, and then there's a receiver, and that's you. And that's all there is to it. That's how, for decades, if not longer, that's how we understood communication to work. And what Hall is saying at the very beginning of this article, to sort of justify his argument moving forward, is that it's more complicated than this. That communication really doesn't work this way, right? So there are, of course, a lot of factors that could figure into an equation like this, and they aren't accounted for here. For example, there could be noise that gets in the way here of the message making it to the receiver, right? Maybe the message is never received, or maybe the receiver misunderstands the message, right? There are a number of factors, that's just two of them, that could complicate this. And so Hall wants to take this old model and sort of do away with it and create a new model for understanding communication. And in particular, he's really interested in this article in dealing with television, and specifically, he's really kind of talking about television news stories. So he wants to look at how television news stories in England, because this is where he worked, he wants to look at this and figure out how do these stories get communicated? How does this whole process work, right? So he divides up this process into more steps, right? Before we just had a sender, a message, and receiver. So he wants to break up the circulation or the distribution of a message into four linked, he calls them, but distinctive moments. So first there's the production of the message, so whatever it is that you're trying to say. Then there's the circulation of the message, right, where the message is made and gets out. Then after that, there's the consumption of the message, right, where the receiver hears the message. And then there's a phase of reproduction, which we can call perhaps more understandably feedback. So in a scenario like this, which is kind of a circular model almost, right? We're big into models in communication. We like circuits. So we come up with the message. We distribute that message. The message is heard, listened to, but then there's feedback afterwards. So someone might say something to you, and you will inevitably provide feedback of some kind. Maybe you nod your head. Maybe you look surprised. Maybe you say, oh, that's interesting, right? There are all kinds of ways that we give feedback in our day-to-day one-on-one or dyadic communications. And so, Hall now is complicating the old model, and he's, again, broken it up into these four parts, and he says for a message to get out there and do its thing, each one of these moments is necessary, but just because one of these steps happens doesn't mean the next one will. So they're linked, but they're also distinctive moments, each in their own right. So he goes on from here, and as I suggested, he's talking about television news largely, right? This is one version of his article. A later version of this article that was published some years after is actually entitled Encoding, Decoding in the Television Process or something of the sort. So it's clear that he's dealing with television. And so here, what he's talking about is he's talking about raw historical events. And so you can think of a raw historical event like something you'd see on the news, right? And so what he's saying here is that the events that are covered on the news, these raw historical events, can't, in that form, be transmitted. So, in other words, you can't see the thing that's happening as if you were there, right? Like you can't experience the actual event. And so, as a result, what's happening is that these events, whatever the news story is about, these things are signified, right? So you're seeing a presentation of it, a mediated presentation of the event, or someone is describing the event to you, right? And all this is happening within the oral visual forms of the televisual discourse. So that's a fancy way of saying you can't witness, excuse me, you can't witness the real event when you're watching the TV news. Instead, what you're watching is maybe a picture of it or a description of it that's limited by the actual medium, by television itself, right? I mean, you can't smell the smoke. You're experiencing probably later than it actually happened, and so on, right? So what you're seeing is a signified version of that event, right? It's not the actual event itself. And so he goes on and he says, paradoxically, the event must become a story, right? It's a news story. So the actual event, let's say you're watching a news story about a murder, right? Even if they film the murder, you're not seeing the murder live in person, right? And in order for that murder to be communicated on TV, it's got to become some kind of a story before it can become a communicative event. Before they can display it to you on TV, before they can send out the message about what happened, they have to turn the actual event into a story. And he says the message form, right, is a determinate moment, but only one. So we can think about, in other words, he's saying, like, when this is turned into a message, we could think about that. What happens to the actual event when it gets turned into the story, right? Because it's no longer the same thing. It's become something different. It's no longer a murder. Now it's a story about a murder, right? And we can look at that, and we can spend a lot of time analyzing the way it changes it when you turn it into a story. But he says even this is just a moment. And it doesn't matter unless people see it and unless it goes through these other phases, right? So here's perhaps an example. We could watch a little bit of this.
We saw the side of the World Trade Center exploded into flames and black smoke. We are going to join another one of our New York affiliates, WABC, for their live coverage.
Plane overhead, and then all of a sudden I thought it sounded kind of louder. Then I looked up, and all of a sudden it smashed right dead into the center of the World Trade Center.
So what you're seeing here is obviously a news story about 9/11, of the World Trade Center attack from 2001. So in this, what we're seeing here, right, you're not standing on the street in New York watching the towers smoldering, and in a few moments another plane flies into it, right? What you're seeing here is not the actual thing, right? Even though it's live, what you're seeing is a mediated representation of that thing, right? So in other words, it's not the actual event. And what you see here with the people talking, trying to figure out what's going on, what you're seeing here is live, the event being turned into a story, being made into a message. And it's interesting because it's clear they don't even know what that story is yet. So you can hear the uncertainty here with the announcers and them trying to figure out what is going on. How do we represent this? How do we turn this into a communicative event so that we can discuss it, so we can send out this message so that other people understand what's happening?
Big flash of flame, fire coming coming out from all over. Then all the bricks is a huge hole right now. It almost looks like the plane probably went through. I'm not sure.
Winston, can you see? Are you on the north side there where the plane made contact?
Yes, I am.
Now, when you say a huge hole, one of our earlier witnesses, Libby Clark, said not much of the plane came down off the building. Much of it went
totally into the building.
It's in the building, from what you can see.
Right.
Now, can you see if there's a lot of debris downstairs, Winston?
No, because it looked like it's inverted. With the impact, everything went inside the building.
Inside.
The only thing.
So again, you get the idea here, where the news anchor and the reporter on the street or in the helicopter are talking, and they're sorting this thing out, right? They're trying to figure out how to turn this reality into a narrative, into a story, so that it can be communicated to audiences, right? And so what the audience is seeing, even though you're seeing this live, you're seeing the images, it's still a story, right? You're not seeing the actual thing in person live. And so this goes to an idea that's widely understood in semiotics, and that is that those images are not the real thing. They're a sign for the real thing, right? And so famously, there's this painting by a painter by the name of René Magritte, and it's of this pipe, and it says underneath here in French, "This is not a pipe." Now, the whole idea here is that Magritte is playing with this notion of semiotics and signs, and what he's really saying here is that this isn't a pipe, it's a painting of a pipe, right? He doesn't say it's a painting of a pipe because he's being clever, but that's what this means, right? This is not a pipe. It's a painting of a pipe. And they're not the same thing. This stands in for the real thing. This is a sign, if you will, of the pipe, but it's not actually a pipe. The same thing can be said of this, right? This isn't the actual 9/11 attack. This is a representation of the 9/11 attack. And this is what Hall is getting at, right? This ultimately is what Hall is trying to say. What he's trying to get at is that anything that you watch on the news isn't a pipe. It's a representation of a pipe. You're not seeing the attack. You're seeing a televisual representation of the attack. And that's different, right? So then he digs into these four different modes, right, or four different elements of communication. And the first one, of course, is production. And he says, the institutional structures of broadcasting with their practices and networks of production, their organized relations and technical infrastructures are required to produce a program. So the first thing he's saying is, look, there's all kinds of stuff that goes into turning these real events into messages, right? There's the institution of broadcasting, so the actual company, the organization, and within this organizations, they have practices, they have certain things that they do and they don't do, certain things that they'll say and won't say. There are, for example, with all news networks, guidelines about what kinds of words to use in particular situations. Some words are acceptable, some words aren't. There's an AP style guide, for example, that tells you, right, like, recently, I know, for example, that they changed, they no longer use the term illegal alien on the news when they talk about people who've entered the U.S. illegally. And these kinds of rules, these kinds of practices then have an impact on the representations or the messages that are sent out. At the same time, they have technical infrastructures. They have their own limitations, right, about the technology that they use, the cameras, the equipment, the broadcasting technology, all these different factors, right? And all these things are required to produce a program, but they also influence or construct the message, right? So the TV message is a product of all these things. and of course the real event isn't. So in some way, production is what changes the real event into a picture or a description of the event, right? So what Hall is saying is we can, in theory, start here with this kind of circuit of culture, which I showed you before with Hartley, examination of the way these messages go out, right? We might as well start with production, where the actual event is translated into a story. And so he goes on and says, production is framed by knowledge and use concerning technical skills, professional ideologies, institutional knowledge, and assumptions about the audience. So in other words, the message that you're getting is being manipulated in a way by the technical skills of the people sending the message, what kind of professional ethics and ideas that might govern the news, institutional knowledge, so what the institution itself knows and believes to be true, and assumptions about the audience. Oh, they won't like to see this, or they will like to see this, or what have you, right? And so, in yet another sense, though, because the social cultural understandings help to frame production, right? So all these things, the audience is both the source of the message in a way and the receiver of the message in a way, right? Because the news people are aiming this message at a particular audience, and they think they know a bunch of things about this audience, and that's what influences the way the story is told. So in a way, the knowledge about the audience acts as kind of a source of the message. And the message, of course, goes to the audience, so they're also the receiver. Right? So that's production. In the next step, the broadcasting structures have to yield what Hall calls an encoded message in the form of meaningful discourse. So what he's saying here is, in essence, that whatever the event was has to be turned into discourse, words, images, right? And then he goes on and says the institution, societal relations of production must pass under the discursive rules of language for its product to be realized. So what they're saying here is maybe they witnessed the real event, but then the event has got to be put into words. You saw them putting the 9/11 attacks into words just a second ago when we watched that video, right? So what he's saying here is that the event has to be turned into words and images, right, for it to be realized. And then, and only then, the event can be circulated as a text, which we need to understand as an encoded message, right? So the reason it's encoded is because there's meaning there, right? I mean, no hidden meanings necessarily, just meaning there, right? So you send a message. The World Trade Center was attacked, right? That's an encoded message. You're trying to send a meaning, and your meaning is that the World Trade Center was attacked. And Hollis says, at this moment, when you turn the real thing into a message, then the rules of language are dominant. So the rules of language take over. The minute you turn a real life event into a story, the rules of language or discourse, which is just communication, right? These rules play the dominant role in the message at that point. So then, before the message can have an effect, satisfy a need, or be put to use by the audience, right, it must first be appropriated as meaningful discourse and meaningfully decoded. So again, fancy language, but not that complicated. What he's saying here is that before the message can do its job, the audience has to understand it as being meaningful discourse. So in other words, something that can be listened to and that you'd want to listen to. And then you got to make sense of it. What are they saying? Are they saying that the World Trade Center got hit? Right? And so you got to make sense of it. So he goes on then and says, it is this set of decoded meanings. So the idea is that the audience have, once they hear and try to understand the message, that have an effect. Okay, so again, once you hear that the World Trade Center has been attacked, you then have to understand it, right? You have to decode the message. Oh my Lord, the World Trade Center got attacked, right? And it's that understanding, right? That's sort of the key part of this whole equation, right? It's that meaning or these meanings that influence, entertain, instruct, or persuade with very complex perceptual, cognitive, emotional, ideological, or behavioral consequences. So what he's saying here is that it's ultimately it's not even the message necessarily in this model that's important. It's the way the audience understands the message. That's the thing. The understanding can influence the audience, can entertain the audience, can instruct the audience, persuade the audience, etc., etc., etc. But it's that understanding. It's not even what the person's trying to say, right? It's how it's understood. That's the key part, right? So then, finally, we have reproduction or feedback, right? And so he says, in a determinate moment, the message via its decodings issues into the structure of social practices. So what he's saying here is that the social practices are the ways that we behave, the way that, so we understand these things, we decode the messages, we understand them, and then we react, right? And oftentimes we react by providing feedback. If it's face to face, again, you might nod your head or shake your head no, or raise an eyebrow or whatever, right? And that's feedback. And so here it's feedback on a much larger scale because you get it out to a whole audience, and then they figure out how they're going to understand it. And then that understanding influences how they work in terms of the real world, their social practices. And these practices then, in turn, influence production. So if a news story goes out, everybody hears it and they react to it and they're talking about it and they change their behavior because of it, and all this happens, then the news notices this. And it acts as feedback. And they think, oh, they like stories like that, so we'll give them more stories like that, for example. Right? So in a way, once you decode the message and you react, that influences the next messages that you'll get. So this is Hall's model, right? Which is similar in a way to the circuit of culture model. We like, again, these kinds of circular models. So it starts out here, right, where we have all these things that affect the message. So this is where, this is kind of the home base for the making of the message. So there are frameworks of knowledge, what the people making the message already know. The relations of production. So this is, who works for who and so on, and how the corporation operates. And then there's the technical infrastructure, right? The limitations of cameras and microphones and broadcasting technology and all this. And so it's here, this is the home of the message. And we have the event, and then the event is encoded rather. It's put into message form, right? So the World Trade Center is falling down. So that's the message that's encoded, right? We take the event and we translate it into a message. And that goes out as a program, as meaningful discourse, right? As a message that's meaningful and can be decoded. It goes out to the audience where they make sense of the message, right? And this influences behavior, which then influences production again, right? You see, this is the same as this. Now, what Hall stresses then, after he gets done explaining this circuit, is the idea that encoding and decoding might not be perfectly symmetrical. What he means by that is that the person hearing the message might not get the message that the sender was trying to send. So in other words, I'll give you an example. So I might say something to my wife like, hey, are you going to do the dishes? But and mean it innocently. But the way she hears it might be uh, more along the lines of, hey, geez, when are you going to do these dishes, right? She might take it as me giving her a hard time and complaining when I'm just asking a question. If that happens, the way I encoded the message is not the way it was decoded. So all that means is there's a misunderstanding, right? And so he goes on and says the degrees of understanding or misunderstanding in the communication depend on the degrees of symmetry, asymmetry established between the positions of the encoder producer and the decoder receiver. So what he's saying here is that we might not, in a sense, be on the same wavelength. That I might say something to you and think it's perfectly understandable. That could be happening in this lecture right now, by the way. I might be saying something to you that I think is completely understandable. But because our positions, right, where we're at aren't the same, my knowledge and your knowledge, for example, aren't the same, then you could understand me incorrectly, right? And when you think about it, we all have different positions or what we call fields of experience. We come from different places. My upbringing was probably different than your upbringing. All the events in my life that brought me up to this point are different than all the events in your life that brought you up to your point. And so as a result, you might understand my message differently because everything you've experienced up to this point is different, right? We see this is the basis of so much of the discussion around things like sexual harassment. Now they tell you, for example, if you're a man working at Georgia State, they show us a video that says, do not compliment your colleagues on their appearance. And the reason they tell you that is because I might say, oh, hey, you look really nice today, to a female colleague, and she might interpret that as me making a pass at her or having sexual interest in her, right? So there could be this kind of misunderstanding, a kind of asymmetrical encoding and decoding, where they don't match up with one another, in other words. And so to justify this argument, we need to think about semiotics and what it teaches us a little bit. So semiotics is the science of communication. Semiotics studies anything that can communicate, right? And so semiotics says that there is a reality that exists outside of language, right? There's a world out there, right? But in order to communicate about reality, we have to put it into a message form. Now, this, for example, is a message. Even though we don't think about it as such, the picture conveys information, right? But the picture, again, is different than the dog. It's not the same as the dog. It's a picture of a dog, but it is not a dog, right? Remember, this is not a pipe. So this picture of the dog, for example, can't bite you. The real dog can. The picture is different, right? And so what semiotics says is even though there's this reality out there in the world, it's constantly mediated through language, right? And so what we can know and say has to be produced in and through discourse, through language, through signs, symbols, right? Because for us, reality is always mediated to begin with. So, in essence, what Hall and what the semioticians are saying is that for us to talk about the biting dog, right, for us to be able to communicate effectively about it, we have to put that message into the form of signs or symbols, right? And so then what we can know about that dog is produced in and through language or images or whatever, right? We always have to sort of transfer things into signs or symbols in order to talk about them. Now, from there, he sort of examines ideology, right? In that he talks about naturalized codes. And he says some codes are so widely used in culture, are learned at such an early age, that they appear to be, quote unquote, natural. So there are a whole bunch of codes that you're used to that you think of as being natural, but they aren't at all. So, for example, when you go to the movies, you are so used to the Hollywood form of storytelling and editing that you don't even think about any of the edits in the film or the way that the narrative is put together or the camera angles, right? All these things are so natural to you that you never give them a second of thought. But of course, there's nothing natural about these things at all. There is no editing in real life, right? But you're so used to it that this whole thing seems perfectly reasonable. And Hall says it's this naturalness that conceals the coding, right? It seems so regular, so normal, that you don't even realize that it's been mediated, right? And so he goes on and says it only proves a connection between the encoding and decoding sides of an exchange of meanings, right? That's all it does. And we should also note at this point too that signs themselves, the signs that we use in our language, in our communication, these things aren't natural either, right? So what a semiotician would say is there's nothing that makes this dog doggish, right? Like no, maybe I should reverse that. There's nothing doggish about this dog. We just choose to call it a dog, seemingly in an arbitrary fashion, and then all just agree that dog means this thing. And if you need proof of that, well, it's a dog here, but it's a Hund in German and a perro in Spanish, right? Which means that the name dog is arbitrary. Again, it's another thing that's not natural. But because you've grown up speaking English your whole life, most of you, you understand when someone says dog, something like this, right? This is what you think about in a way, right? But again, there's nothing natural about that. It's just a word that we made up to represent something and then all agreed upon. Now, to further complicate the problem of these signs, the signs themselves are what we call polysemic. Now, polysemic means that they have more than one meaning, right? So, signs, according to this, have more than one meaning. So the word dog, right? If we think of that as a sign, right? Well, dog has more than one meaning, doesn't it? You could be, it could be all men are dogs, or look at my new dog. These mean very different things, of course, right? And it doesn't have to be just words that have multiple meanings. Here's an example. So what does this sign mean? Right? Well, when I ask you what does this sign mean, what I'm really asking for is what Hall would call the preferred meaning. So the preferred meaning is, the meaning that the sender is trying to send. And here, in a funny way, admittedly, the sender is trying to say no dogs, no smoking, no skateboarding, and no drinking, right? But we could also read this as like, the coolest dog in the world is not allowed in the park. Because, maybe this is the coolest dog. Maybe he's getting hammered and smoking out and doing some skateboarding, right? I know that's silly, but it shows you that signs can be interpreted in different ways. And that's what Hall is getting at largely, right? What Hall is really famous for isn't the 4 steps in the production of a television news story or in the production of a message, what he's really famous for is this idea that messages can be interpreted in different ways, right? And so that's really what he's getting at. And then he goes on and he explains, he says, listen, there's really three different kinds of ways that we can understand messages, right? Or three different positions that we could take on messages. We could take on the dominant position, the negotiated position, or an oppositional position, right? So let's look at these. So let's say I see a news story and I really agree with everything that it's saying, and I accept the preferred meaning, right? Or I reproduce, in his words, the preferred reading, right? So when I do this, it seems like the message is natural, it's transparent, right? So if if you say to me, for example, war is bad for children, if you say to most people, war is bad for children, children shouldn't be hurt in wars, right? 99.999% of people are going to agree with you. They're going to take a dominant position on that. And they're going to adopt the preferred reading because it just seems like common sense. Nobody's going to argue with that, right? So that's an example of a dominant reading or a dominant position. Now you could also take a negotiated position. And this is where you kind of agree with the message, right? You accept probably most of it, but there's some parts of it that you don't really agree with. So let's say that you're, and I'm making this up. This is not to pick on any political party, but let's say that you're leaning Republican in the elections, and you really agree with most of the messages you hear from them, but you're also worried about abortion because you think people should have a right to choose. Well, then you probably have what we would call a negotiated reading of a Republican campaign ad. Well, yeah, I agree with most of it, but I don't agree with this part, right? So you've taken a negotiated position or you've done a negotiated reading. And then finally, there's the oppositional reading or position. And that's when you hear a message that's been encoded. You understand what they're trying to tell you, but you reject it, right? You just say, no, I don't like this at all. And so what's interesting about this then, if we go all the way back to the beginning and we remember that linear message model with the sender, message, and receiver, there was no room for any of these kinds of readings. And these are really the ways that people deal with messages, right? I mean, people listen to politicians, for example, and they say, yeah, hell yeah, I agree with that, right? 100%. Or maybe you're like, well, I kind of agree with that. Or maybe you're like, oh my God, I totally disagree with that. And it's not just politicians. It could be news stories. It could be at church. It could be the message of a television show or of a book or of a course that you have in college, right? We always have the opportunity to take these different stances. And prior to Hall, a lot of people didn't consider that. And of course, this is also the thing that people don't consider when they do things like criticize video games for being violent. Oh, well, if kids watch violent video games, they're going to become violent. Well, I mean, to do that, they'd very certainly have to take a dominant reading, right? And agree with, if the message of the video game really is that violence is good, then they'd have to agree with that 100% and then act on it. But how many times have you seen a violent movie or heard someone say something about hurting someone and you think to yourself, oh no, right? That's really bad. I'd never do that. And so what Hall's getting at here is that, we can't just look at these messages on their face value, right? In fact, the face value of the message doesn't matter as much as how people make sense of that message and then how they react to it, right? So for Hall, that's more important in a sense than even the message itself. And so then I have a little video here that has a pretty clear dominant message. You're welcome to watch it on your own and see how it makes you feel. I can't play it here because I'll get dinged by YouTube for copyright infringement. Normally I show it in class. But you can check out this video. It's got a clear message, and you can decide, how do you feel about it? Do you agree 100% with Toby Keith? Do you agree a little bit? Or are you like, oh no, this is a little bit much? Right? So again, I'll stress to you, the really important understanding that I want you to take from the encoding, decoding reading isn't even so much the circuit of the way the messages are put together and distributed, as the idea that Hall has that sometimes the message that's sent and what people understand are two different things. And then on top of it, people can react in at least three different ways to any given message. They can agree with it completely, they can agree with it a little bit and disagree a little bit, or they can understand the message and disagree with it completely. Now, of course, they can also not understand the message at all, but Hall doesn't really deal with that. Okay, that's it for this particular lecture. I hope this wasn't too confusing, and thank you for checking it out.